This video is going to be a pretty informal analysis of S-modafinil. So I guess we can start with the fact that if you didn't know, S-modafinil is the S enantiomer of the drug modafinil. There is the R enantiomer and the S enantiomer. The R enantiomer is known as R-Modafinil and it is officially marketed as Nuvigil. And both the R-Modafinil and the S-modafinil exist in Provigil, which is just racemic modafinil. The main differences between R-Modafinil and S-modafinil are that S-modafinil is about 3 times weaker of a substrate for the dopamine transporter and elevates dopamine levels to a much lesser degree because of it. However, both S-modafinil and R-Modafinil have pro-wakefulness effects. Another key difference between S-modafinil and R-Modafinil is that pharmacokinetically, S-modafinil is cleared from the organism's system much more quickly. The half-life of S-modafinil is between 3 and 5 hours, whereas the half-life of R-Modafinil is about 10 to 13 hours, which can be escalated to 13 to 15 hours when dosed constantly. It's pretty obvious why S-modafinil was never pursued for clinical drug development in terms of the indications that modafinil was originally indicated for, which all seem to involve some sort of sleep disorder, say narcolepsy, idiopathic hypersomnia, or sleep shift work disorder. Or I don't even know how they call it, but something similar to that. And the fact that R-Modafinil lasts much longer is clinically useful because it requires only once daily dosing, and in the case of narcolepsy, the extended half-life bleeding into the next day might actually be part of its therapeutic benefit. Regardless, R-Modafinil doesn't seem to impair sleep, even in people without narcolepsy when taken early in the day at doses that are prescribed. Despite this, though, I still think that S-modafinil has a lot of therapeutic potential, even for sleep indications, and I'll discuss that here. First off, there's probably drugs that are better than S-modafinil at the things I'm going to talk about. They might be undiscovered or they might be discovered. But the key difference to take in is that S-modafinil is very well characterized. We have hundreds of clinical trials looking at the efficacy and safety of racemic modafinil, and it's not too far-fetched to extrapolate that type of data, at least in terms of safety, to R-Modafinil, S-modafinil on its own. In those clinical trials, racemic modafinil is relatively safe. At higher doses where it's been tested for ADHD, it tends to have a lot of side effects, but this is really just an artifact of the fact that it's used at ridiculous dosages to achieve the necessary amount of increase in dopaminergic tone to treat something like ADHD, for which modafinil is clearly not a good drug for. The first type of use I envision for S-modafinil is that it could be used to combat social jet lag or actual jet lag in a way that is more effective than modafinil and doesn't require exposing a patient to a full day's worth of. Particularly, I think social jet lag is a key driver of lost productivity and danger in the Western world, simply because many people go from their 9 to 5 during the weekday to staying up late in the weekend and then transitioning back to a 9 to 5. And you see this in statistics, the fact that there's more car crashes on Monday morning than there are in any other day of the week. And it's pretty obvious why. So a drug like S-modafinil lasting only, having a half-life of only 3 to 5 hours could be useful as a non-addictive, because I'm extrapolating from what modafinil's data is, a non-addictive waking or sobering drug, if you will, for people who are cognitively impaired or sluggish because they are sleep deprived. And in general, that might lead to less deaths on, say, the road. And extending upon that idea, S-modafinil might be therapeutically useful for shifting circadian rhythms. There's a pretty good amount of evidence supporting melatonin for negative, if you will, enforcement of the circadian clock. Melatonin essentially helps to shift the circadian rhythm depending to where it's dosed, if it's dosed in appropriate amounts. However, melatonin can only be used at night to set a nighttime rhythm, and it's only one part of the equation because circadian rhythm is also modulated by daytime activities and exposures, such as exposure to blue light from the sun. And then also physical activity helps enforce the circadian rhythm during the day, which is evidenced by the fact that physical activity, particularly cardiovascular activity, actually improves insomnia symptoms. So, in turn, modafinil could be used as a medication to positively, S-modafinil could be used as a medication to positively enforce the circadian clock in people who have perhaps irregular circadian clocks or individuals who are socially or actually jet lagged and who might require a rapid change of their circadian rhythm without significant impairments. There is preliminary evidence supporting the use of stimulants to positively enforce the circadian rhythm to the benefit of conditions such as insomnia. Particularly, there are a few good studies in ADHD showing that ADHD stimulants actually normalize sleep patterns and sleep architecture in patients who have had their doses properly titrated. This effect is less pronounced with extended release stimulants, but it's still preliminary evidence to show that positive enforcement might be beneficial to insomnia. Furthermore, I already talked about the fact that there are many studies that support physical exercise and daytime light exposure as positive ways to enforce the circadian clock. And when you look into modafinil's pharmacology, which is quite elusive, the little that we do know is that modafinil, the reason we call it a eugeroic drug, is it increases dopamine and therefore it's dopamine norepinephrine and therefore it's called a stimulant. But it's also called a eugeroic because it seems to bias or at least increase histaminergic and orexinergic tone to a greater degree than drugs like amphetamine and methylphenidate when the dopamine increase is equipotent. This isn't to say that drugs like methamphetamine and amphetamine can't wake people up. In fact, they probably wake people up more effectively than modafinil does. But there's the added side effect that they're euphoric stimulants, and high doses are not appropriate for this. Modafinil, on the other hand, seems to be a bit more biased in this and offers, as I said, histaminergic and orexinergic tone. So a shorter acting modafinil, which is essentially what S-modafinil might be, but we don't know how good S-modafinil is at increasing histaminergic and orexinergic tone, could offer a way to positively enforce the circadian clock in the same way that exercise and light exposure do. Because when you look at the mechanisms of action of light exposure, particularly blue light exposure, a lot of that has to do with the release of orexin, which I didn't define yet, but I probably should. Orexin is a lesser known neuropeptide that is one of the master regulators of wakefulness. It's called orexin because it also stimulates appetite, but exposure to light, particularly light, full wavelengths, those that come from the sun, but particularly blue light, causes an increase in orexin, and orexin causes a type of wakefulness that doesn't necessarily increase locomotor activity, such as like norepinephrine or dopaminergic drugs might, although they still increase orexin to some capacity. Another potential use I see for S-modafinil is actually in the ways that modafinil is already used. Modafinil is, of course, officially indicated for sleep shift, work disorder, and narcolepsy, but we're kidding ourselves if it's not used for other things. I think 90% of modafinil prescriptions are off-label or something like that. Now, modafinil is actually sanctioned by certain organizations such as, I think NASA. Yeah, NASA definitely has sanctioned it for use on the space station. The US government has called it a go pill, an approved go pill, that it actually replaced amphetamine for this reason. And there is some decent, self-reported, albeit, data suggesting that there is some use amongst medical workers, emergency workers, academics, stuff like that. Now, I think in terms of the medical worker use is quite interesting because some of these medical workers are, for example, surgeons or emergency medical workers, and they work professions where one mistake can cost someone their life, or maybe their own life, if they're something like working in a dangerous environment, right? So modafinil is already used for these things, but I wonder how bad the side effects are for people who are using modafinil for this reason, both officially sanctioned and somewhat off-label. If they, after the job is done, say after the surgeon has done the surgery, if they're still suffering from lingering effects of modafinil, especially since modafinil is probably used at least occasionally in times where someone would typically not be awake so that they can stay awake. So I probably envision that modafinil has been used on many occasions for some surgeon who's on call, just got called in at 3 a.m. and they took modafinil and they have to do a surgery, but they decided that they have to take modafinil because they know their own body, they know how they function, and that's the decision they made. So if we could instead have an officially sanctioned, just like in the US military and with astronauts, S-modafinil for surgeons or for emergency workers or rescue workers, that might be a better therapeutic because it would realistically, at least I'm presuming, because of the pharmacokinetic half-life and the similarities to R-Modafinil otherwise, wear off much sooner than traditional racemic modafinil or R-Modafinil would. And this might be good because then they can go back to their home, to their families, or just not be under the influence of a drug beyond the point at which it's needed. I don't actually think modafinil could be a good replacement for caffeine in society. Unlike caffeine, modafinil has not been shown to have any real ties to neurodegenerative disease. And I'm not saying that caffeine is contributing to neurodegenerative disease. In fact, there's observational and some experimental data with animals to say the opposite. But that's exactly what I'm saying, is that there's no 80-year observational trial with modafinil, but there are with caffeine, and caffeine is a, yeah, culturally kind of shoehorned in drug, but I would not say this about alcohol because alcohol, of course, is not neuroprotective in any capacity. And it's probably best that you drink no alcohol for your health, but the same cannot be said for caffeine. And at worst, caffeine might be neutral for someone's health, but at best, it actually might be beneficial. So, for that reason, we can't say the same thing about modafinil, and I don't think it's appropriate to suggest that modafinil could replace caffeine in this way because there's just not enough evidence and the risks do not outweigh the costs here. Because it's one thing if a surgeon takes modafinil, it's another if just a person takes modafinil like they take caffeine every single day of their life for 80 years on average, right? Well, no, 70 because they probably haven't started taking it when they're 9 years old or something. But still, so yeah, that's my stance on it. Oh, and a little fun fact is that there actually is a modafinil analog that's patented by Red Bull. I plan to put that in my video, but it's interesting because they haven't really done anything with it. But it's kind of crazy how, I realistically think that the first drugs that will be included in energy drinks, although you can argue that there's already drugs in energy drinks, will be something along the lines of methylxanthines derivatives, which caffeine is a methylxanthine, and there's plenty of other methylxanthines that have been investigated Some of them are being sold as supplements. But I never really would have thought that an energy drink company would have patented something, an analog of a scheduled drug. It's interesting. I'll keep following it, but that kind of goes against what I was saying before, right? Anyways, that's the end of the video. I might do more content like this if you guys are interested. Let me know, I guess. And yeah, do your research and stay safe. Bye.